History of the American Revolution as an inevitable march toward independence, a story driven by bold declarations and heroic victories. But in the summer of 1776, independence did not feel inevitable at all. It felt fragile, temporary, and dangerously close to failure. New York City, the most important city in the colonies, was descending into chaos as fires burned through wooden neighborhoods and thick smoke lingered over the streets, while civilians fled with their possessions and British warships filled the harbor like immovable monuments of imperial power. To the British Empire, the rebellion was already collapsing. They had the world's most experienced army, the strongest navy on earth, and commanders who believed that a group of colonies could not possibly defeat a global empire. From their perspective, this war was not a struggle for survival, but a matter of restoring order. To George Washington, however, the situation was far more desperate. He was not standing confidently at the head of a victorious army, but retreating, hiding, and constantly calculating how to keep his forces from dissolving entirely. The Continental Army was exhausted, underpaid, and poorly trained, made up largely of farmers and laborers who had never expected to fight a professional military. Many soldiers were nearing the end of their enlistments, and desertion was becoming increasingly common as fear spread through the camps. Supplies were scarce, discipline was inconsistent, and disease often proved as deadly as British gunfire. Washington knew that another major defeat could end the revolution completely, not because the colonies lacked courage, but because they lacked endurance. The British victory at the Battle of Long Island made this reality painfully clear. American forces were outmaneuvered, overwhelmed, and forced into retreat, exposing the limits of their conventional military strength. British commanders controlled the battlefield with confidence, while American troops struggled to adapt. More importantly, the British controlled information. They knew where American units were positioned, they intercepted messages, and they moved with the advantage of intelligence gathered through loyalists, informants, and established networks within occupied cities. Washington, by contrast, often made decisions based on incomplete or outdated information, guessing at enemy intentions rather than knowing them. This imbalance created a silent crisis. Washington could train soldiers, recruit more men, and hope for foreign support, but without reliable intelligence, every movement carried enormous risk. Marching blindly against a superior force was a gamble he could not afford. The realization was deeply unsettling because it suggested that courage alone would not save the revolution. Something more subtle, more disciplined, and more dangerous was required. It was under this pressure that Washington made his first serious attempt to gather intelligence behind enemy lines. The task fell to Nathan Hale, a young schoolteacher from Connecticut whose sense of duty outweighed his lack of experience. Hale volunteered to spy on British forces in New York, driven by idealism rather than preparation. He crossed into enemy territory disguised as a civilian, carrying notes openly and relying on his ability to blend in. But the world of espionage was unforgiving. Without training, secure contacts, or coded communication, Hale was exposed almost immediately. He was arrested by the British, identified as a spy, and executed without trial, hanged as a warning to anyone who might attempt the same. Hale's death echoed through the American camp. His final words, remembered as a declaration of selfless patriotism, would later be celebrated as heroic, but in that moment, his execution was a devastating failure. For Washington, it was not just the loss of a young volunteer, but proof that the revolution could not afford improvised intelligence efforts. Spying was not an extension of bravery. It was a profession that demanded patience, secrecy, and methodical planning. Sending untrained men into enemy territory did not weaken the British. It strengthened them by exposing American desperation. This moment marked a turning point in Washington's thinking. He began to understand that the revolution required a kind of warfare that was uncomfortable, morally complex, and largely invisible. Open battles would still matter, but they would not decide the war alone. Information would. Knowing where the enemy was, what they planned, and how they thought could mean the difference between survival and collapse. Yet building such a system went against the culture of the time, which valued honor, openness, and public recognition. Espionage was associated with deception and betrayal, activities many considered dishonorable. Despite this discomfort, Washington recognized that secrecy itself had to become a weapon. The British Empire thrived on structure, hierarchy, and predictable military behavior. To defeat it, the Americans would need to operate outside those expectations, creating networks that were hidden, flexible, and nearly impossible to trace. These networks could not rely on soldiers or famous leaders because those people were watched too closely. They would need ordinary individuals whose daily lives provided perfect cover for extraordinary risk. By the end of 1776, the American Revolution stood at its most dangerous point. Independence had been declared, but it had not been secured. The army was fragile, public confidence was uncertain, and the enemy appeared unstoppable. Yet within this collapse, a new idea was quietly forming, an idea that would change the course of the war. The realization that secrecy, intelligence, and deception could succeed where force alone had failed marked the beginning of a hidden struggle, one that would unfold not on battlefields, but in letters, whispers, and coded messages. America was losing the war in plain sight, but in the shadows, it was about to begin fighting in an entirely new way. By the winter of 1776, George Washington was no longer thinking only like a general. He was thinking like a survivor. The Continental Army had narrowly avoided complete destruction, retreating across New Jersey under constant pressure from British forces, and Washington understood that every decision he made from this point forward carried existential weight. Letters written during this period reveal a man deeply aware of his limitations, frustrated by uncertainty, and haunted by the knowledge that he was fighting an enemy who seemed to know more about him than he knew about them. Victory, if it came at all, would not be quick, and it would not come through conventional means alone. Washington's fear was not cowardice, but clarity. He saw what others still refused to accept, that the British Empire operated with an advantage beyond muskets and ships. It had networks of loyalists, informants, merchants, and officials who supplied information effortlessly. British officers moved confidently through occupied cities, gathering intelligence as a matter of routine, while American commanders relied on rumors and delayed reports. Every time Washington ordered a march or chose a defensive position, he was gambling with incomplete knowledge. The revolution could not survive on guesswork. This realization forced Washington to confront an uncomfortable truth about warfare. Traditional European military honor had little use for deception, yet deception was exactly what the Americans needed. Washington began studying how his enemy gathered information, how they intercepted correspondence, and how they identified threats before they fully emerged. Slowly, his thinking shifted. Intelligence could no longer be a side activity. It had to become an organized, protected system integrated into every strategic decision. This required not just courage, but discipline and patience, qualities that did not always come naturally to a revolutionary movement driven by passion. One of Washington's greatest challenges was secrecy itself. The Continental Army was filled with idealists who believed deeply in transparency and trust, but espionage thrived on compartmentalization. If too many people knew too much, the system would collapse. Washington began to insist that intelligence operations remain hidden even from his own officers, a decision that created tension and suspicion, but protected the fragile networks he hoped to build. He accepted that some sacrifices would never be acknowledged, and that some successes would never be publicly celebrated. As Washington refined his approach, he sought individuals who could manage secrecy without craving recognition. He needed people who were intelligent,
disciplined and emotionally restrained. Among those who stood out was Benjamin Talmadge, a young officer who had demonstrated loyalty, careful judgment, and an ability to keep silent. Talmadge understood that the most effective spies were not those who acted bravely in dramatic moments, but those who could endure long periods of fear without drawing attention to themselves. Washington entrusted Talmadge to be the kind of man who could build something sustainable rather than heroic. At the same time, Washington began to rethink the role of civilians in the war. Soldiers were visible targets, constantly watched by British forces and Loyalist sympathizers. Civilians, however, moved freely through occupied territories, conducted business, visited taverns, and attended social gatherings without suspicion. Their normal routines offered the perfect cover for observation. This realization marked a turning point in American strategy as Washington began to see ordinary life itself as a battlefield, where information could be collected quietly and passed along without ever revealing its true purpose. The failure of Nathan Hale lingered in Washington's mind as a warning. Hale had been brave, but bravery had made him careless. The new intelligence system would be built on restraint, anonymity, and repetition. Messages would be coded, identities would be concealed, trust would be earned slowly and tested constantly. Washington began approving funds for secret operations, disguises, and communications methods, often without recording details that could later expose participants. In doing so, he laid the foundation for a practice that future intelligence agencies would adopt, protecting secrets by limiting documentation. Washington's reinvention was not immediate or perfect. Mistakes were made, and some early intelligence efforts failed quietly, their participants disappearing into obscurity. But with each attempt, Washington refined his understanding of how intelligence functioned in a prolonged conflict. Information was not valuable unless it was reliable, timely, and protected. A single exposed agent could compromise an entire network, and a single careless message could undo months of careful work. By early 1777, Washington had transformed his greatest weakness into a developing strength. He no longer viewed intelligence as a desperate measure, but as a core element of survival. The revolution was still fragile, and the army still struggled. But beneath the visible failures, a new layer of warfare was emerging. It operated slowly, cautiously, and invisibly, relying on people whose names would never appear in history books and whose contributions would remain hidden for generations. This quiet reinvention did not produce immediate victories, but it produced something more important: endurance. Washington learned how to stay alive in a war he could not yet win. He learned how to wait, how to observe, and how to exploit moments of opportunity created by superior information. As the British focused on crushing the rebellion through force, Washington prepared to undermine them through knowledge. The revolution's future would depend not on grand gestures, but on secrets carefully kept and passed along by people who understood that silence itself could be a weapon.
By 1778, the war had entered a phase of exhaustion rather than momentum, and it was in this environment that Washington's ideas about intelligence finally solidified into something permanent. The British still occupied New York City, using it as a command center for operations throughout the colonies, while Washington's army remained largely outside the city, unable to retake it by force. This separation created a dangerous gap. The enemy's plans were being made in New York, but the Americans had no reliable way of knowing what those plans were. Washington understood that without consistent access to information from inside the city, every campaign would remain reactive rather than strategic. To solve this problem, Washington turned fully to Benjamin Talmadge, granting him authority to design and manage a professional intelligence network. Talmadge approached the task with caution and realism. He knew that soldiers, officers, and well-known patriots were the most likely to be noticed, questioned, or arrested. Instead of seeking dramatic figures, he sought people who were already invisible in plain sight. His solution was personal rather than political. Talmadge returned to Setauket, the small Long Island town where he had grown up, and began recruiting individuals he had known since childhood, people whose routines were familiar, predictable, and unlikely to arouse suspicion. The men and women Talmadge selected were not spies by profession or temperament. They were farmers, merchants, sailors, and tavern keepers who lived ordinary lives under British occupation. Their greatest qualification was not bravery, but consistency. They knew how to behave naturally in front of British soldiers, how to listen without reacting, and how to blend into daily life without drawing attention. These individuals did not see themselves as heroes. Many initially viewed their role as simply helping the war effort in small, indirect ways, unaware of the full scope of what they were becoming part of. Talmadge deliberately limited what each person knew, ensuring that no single capture could expose the entire system. This emerging network would later be known as the Culper Ring, named after the codename Culper used in their correspondence. It was not organized like a military unit with ranks and formal commands, but rather as a chain of trust and communication. Information flowed slowly, moving from occupied New York through Long Island and across the Sound to Washington's headquarters. Couriers risked capture at every crossing, navigating British patrols, unpredictable weather, and the constant threat of betrayal. Each successful delivery was a small victory, achieved without fanfare or recognition. Talmadge placed enormous emphasis on discipline. Spies were instructed to avoid unnecessary risks, to gather information only when it could be done naturally, and to abandon missions if conditions became unsafe. This patience often conflicted with the urgency of wartime needs, but Talmadge understood that survival mattered more than speed. A single exposed agent could destroy months of careful work. The Culper Ring operated on the principle that secrecy was more valuable than bravery, and that restraint was the true measure of commitment. Washington supported this approach even when it tested his patience. He accepted that intelligence would arrive slowly and that it would often be incomplete. What mattered was its reliability. When reports from the Culper Ring began to reach him, Washington noticed a change in the quality of information he received. Instead of rumors and guesses, he now had access to details about British troop movements, supply shortages, internal disagreements, and strategic priorities. This information did not win battles overnight, but it allowed Washington to avoid disasters and exploit opportunities when they emerged. The existence of the Culper Ring also changed how Washington thought about leadership. He began to appreciate the power of decentralized operations, where success depended not on a single figure, but on a web of individuals working independently toward a shared goal. This model contrasted sharply with the hierarchical structure of the British military and gave the Americans a subtle advantage. The British expected to fight an army. They did not expect to fight a network. Living under British occupation required constant psychological discipline. Members of the Culper Ring interacted daily with soldiers who could execute them on suspicion alone. They attended social gatherings, served food and drinks, conducted business, and listened carefully, storing away fragments of conversation that might later prove valuable. The strain of maintaining this double life was immense. There were no uniforms, no signals of belonging, and no guarantees of support if things went wrong. Each participant understood that capture would likely mean death, and that their sacrifice would remain unacknowledged. Despite these risks, the network endured. It survived because it was built on trust, familiarity, and shared purpose rather than ideology alone. Talmadge's decision to recruit people who already knew each other reduced the likelihood of betrayal and strengthened the system's resilience. Over time, the Culper Ring became one of Washington's most reliable sources of intelligence, shaping decisions that would influence the course of the war.
The birth of the Culper Ring marked a quiet but profound shift in the American Revolution. The war was no longer fought solely on open fields and fortified towns, but in kitchens, taverns, and private conversations. Information became a weapon wielded by people who would never appear in paintings or monuments. As the British continued to rely on force and visibility, the Americans learned to operate in shadows, slowly turning secrecy into an advantage that would prove decisive in the years to come.
Life under British occupation did not feel like constant battle. It felt like constant pressure. In cities and towns controlled by the Crown, especially New York City and large parts of Long Island, daily life continued on the surface, with markets opening, taverns filling, and churches holding services. Yet beneath this appearance of normalcy existed a climate of fear, surveillance, and uncertainty. British officers, soldiers, and Loyalist supporters moved freely through these spaces, watching closely for signs of rebellion, listening for careless words, and enforcing loyalty through intimidation. For the ordinary people who would become part of the Culper Ring, survival depended on appearing compliant while quietly resisting. British-occupied New York was a city transformed into a military headquarters. Streets were crowded with soldiers, ships filled the harbor, and buildings were repurposed as barracks, prisons, and administrative offices. The British believed control of the city gave them control of the war, and in many ways they were right. From New York, they coordinated troop movements, managed supply lines, and planned campaigns across the colonies. Information flowed easily among British officers, often discussed openly in social settings where they assumed loyalty or indifference from those around them. This assumption would become one of their greatest weaknesses. For civilians, daily interactions became exercises in restraint. Facial expressions had to be controlled. Even silence could draw suspicion if it seemed unnatural. Loyalists and informants were rewarded, while suspected patriots risked imprisonment, confiscation of property, or worse. Public executions and prison ships served as constant reminders of the cost of resistance. The British did not need to arrest everyone. They only needed to create an atmosphere where fear policed behavior. Members of the Culper Ring learned to navigate this environment with remarkable discipline. Their intelligence gathering did not involve dramatic espionage acts, but careful observation over time. A tavern keeper might notice which officers drank together regularly, which ones argued about orders, and which regiments complained about shortages. A merchant might observe fluctuations in supply requests or changes in shipping schedules. A household servant might overhear casual remarks during meals or social gatherings. Individually, these details seemed insignificant, but when combined, they formed a clearer picture of British intentions. One of the greatest challenges for the Culper Ring was emotional isolation. Participants could not share their fears or successes with neighbors, friends, or even family members. To protect the network, secrecy extended inward as much as outward. Each person knew what was necessary, creating a lonely form of service where trust existed without full transparency. This isolation was not accidental, it was essential. A captured agent could reveal only fragments of the system, preserving the rest. British authorities intensified their surveillance as the war dragged on. Mail was intercepted, travel was restricted, and patrols increased along coastal routes. These measures forced the Culper Ring to adapt constantly, altering routes, changing couriers, and abandoning compromised methods. Patience became the defining skill of survival. Weeks might pass without sending a single message, not because information was unavailable, but because the risk was too great. In these moments, restraint saved lives.
The psychological toll of living under occupation cannot be overstated. Every interaction carried the possibility of exposure. A misplaced glance, an overheard comment, or an unexpected search could end everything. Yet the spies endured because their actions were woven into daily life so seamlessly that even they sometimes forgot the full extent of their risk. The routines of farming, trading, and socializing provided a strange form of protection, allowing extraordinary activities to hide within ordinary behavior. Women played an especially critical role during this period, precisely because they were often underestimated. British officers tended to view women as apolitical and unthreatening, assuming they were removed from military affairs. This assumption allowed women to move freely, attend gatherings, and manage households that became informal centers of information. Without drawing attention, they listened, remembered, and passed along details that might otherwise have been lost. Their contributions were rarely recorded, but they were essential to the network's success. Despite the constant danger, the Culper Ring remained active, refining its methods and strengthening its resilience. The British Empire relied on visible power, troops, ships, and authority, while the Americans learned to operate invisibly, turning everyday life into a tool of resistance. Each day survived under occupation was a small victory, not because it weakened the British directly, but because it preserved the network that Washington depended upon. Living under British occupation was not heroic in the traditional sense. There were no battles to celebrate, no clear moments of triumph. Instead, there was endurance, discipline, and the quiet determination to continue. The Culper Ring existed within this tension, proving that resistance did not always require open defiance. Sometimes it required patience, silence, and the willingness to wait for the right moment. As the war continued, these quiet acts of survival would begin to shape events far beyond occupied streets and guarded harbors, influencing decisions made hundreds of miles away at the highest levels of command.
As the Culper Ring matured, its greatest strength was not the bravery of its members, but the systems that protected them. Intelligence, once gathered, was useless unless it could travel safely from occupied territory to Washington's headquarters. And in a war where interception often meant execution, communication became the most dangerous stage of all. To survive, the Culper Ring transformed ordinary correspondence into a battlefield of deception, where meaning was hidden beneath layers of normality, and secrecy relied not on speed, but on subtlety. One of the most effective tools in this invisible war was invisible ink, known at the time as sympathetic stain. The liquid appeared clear once dried, leaving letters that looked harmless to British inspectors. Only when brushed with a specific chemical would the hidden message reveal itself, emerging between the lines of an otherwise innocent letter. This method allowed spies to send detailed intelligence without arousing suspicion, even when correspondence was intercepted and examined. The brilliance of sympathetic stain lay in its simplicity. The letter did not look encrypted or secret, and its true purpose remained invisible unless the reader knew exactly how to reveal it. Yet invisible ink alone was not enough. If a message was discovered after being revealed, its contents still needed protection. To solve this problem, Benjamin Talmadge created a numerical cipher system, assigning numbers to names, locations, and frequently used words. This cipher included hundreds of entries, allowing messages to be written in long strings of numbers that appeared meaningless to anyone without the codebook. George Washington himself was reduced to a number, stripping his identity from the message and protecting both the sender and recipient. Even if British authorities suspected espionage, deciphering the content would require time and resources they rarely possessed. Signals were also hidden in plain sight through methods that relied on everyday routines. One of the most famous examples involved Anna Strong, a woman living on Long Island whose laundry became a communication tool. A black petticoat hung on her clothesline signaled that a message was ready for pickup, while the number of handkerchiefs displayed nearby indicated which hidden cove a courier should use. To anyone else, the clothesline appeared unremarkable, blending into the domestic landscape. To the Culper ring, it was a silent broadcast system operating under constant observation. Transporting messages across Long Island Sound was among the riskiest tasks. Couriers navigated dark waters in small boats, avoiding British patrols and unpredictable weather. These crossings were often delayed for days or weeks, not due to lack of information, but because the conditions were too dangerous. Patience was essential. Intelligence that arrived late but intact was far more valuable than intelligence delivered quickly at the cost of exposure. The Culper ring accepted delay as a necessary price for survival. Washington's role in this system extended beyond receiving information. He studied intelligence carefully, cross-referencing reports and testing their reliability before acting. This cautious approach prevented overreaction and reduced the risk of acting on false information planted by the enemy. Over time, Washington developed a sophisticated understanding of intelligence analysis, learning to interpret patterns rather than isolated facts. This skill allowed him to anticipate British movements and adjust his strategies accordingly. The British, meanwhile, struggled to comprehend the nature of the threat they faced. They focused their efforts on capturing individuals, believing that dismantling a few suspected spies would end the problem. They did not fully grasp that they were facing a decentralized system designed to survive loss and adapt to pressure. Each arrest prompted changes in routes, codes, and procedures, ensuring that the network could continue operating even under increased scrutiny. The invisible war extended beyond physical messages. Misinformation became a weapon as well. At times, the Culper ring deliberately allowed minor or misleading details to circulate, creating confusion and diverting British attention. These efforts were subtle and carefully controlled, intended not to provoke drastic responses, but to create uncertainty. In war, uncertainty can be as powerful as accurate intelligence, forcing the enemy to hesitate or miscalculate. The emotional discipline required to sustain this system was immense. Spies had to resist the urge to act quickly, to reveal their importance, or to seek recognition. Success depended on remaining unnoticed, blending into daily life so completely that even neighbors might forget their presence. The Culper ring's greatest victories were those no one ever recognized, moments when a disaster was quietly avoided or an opportunity was seized without public explanation. As the war continued, this invisible conflict grew in importance. Battles were still fought and lives were still lost on open fields, but beneath these events ran a parallel struggle of information and deception. The Culper ring demonstrated that intelligence could shape the course of war without ever appearing in official reports or dramatic accounts. Codes, ink, and silent signals became tools as powerful as muskets and cannons, and through them the Americans gained an advantage that the British never fully understood. By mastering the art of secrecy, the Culper ring did more than protect its members. It changed how the revolution was fought. The war was no longer decided solely by strength and numbers, but by patience, creativity, and the ability to remain invisible. In this hidden struggle, America began to learn how to win without being seen.
Among all the names, numbers, and fragments that passed through the Culper ring, one figure stands apart precisely because she never had a name. In the cipher book created by Benjamin Tolmatch, she was known only as 355, a number that signified lady, and that single reference has become one of the most enduring mysteries of the American Revolution. While the men of the Culper ring gathered intelligence through trade, travel, and observation, Agent 355 appears to have operated within a different and more dangerous world, one shaped by social proximity rather than physical movement. British-occupied New York was not only a military center, but a social one. Officers attended dinners, dances, and gatherings where conversations flowed freely under the assumption of loyalty. In these settings, rank relaxed, and sensitive information often surfaced in casual remarks. Agent 355 is believed to have been part of this world, a woman whose social position allowed her to move among British officers without suspicion. She listened carefully, remembered details, and understood which words mattered. Her role was not to confront or interrogate, but to observe patiently and blend into the background of high society. What makes Agent 355 so compelling is not just her anonymity, but the nature of the intelligence attributed to her. Reports associated with her involvement suggest access to conversations at the highest levels of British command. This implies education, confidence, and the ability to navigate complex social environments where a single misstep could expose her. Unlike couriers who risked capture while traveling, Agent 355 risked exposure every time she spoke, smiled, or remained silent in the presence of men who held the power to end her life on suspicion alone. The Culper Ring protected her identity with extraordinary care. Even within the network, details were limited, and Washington himself may never have known her true name. This secrecy was intentional. If captured, she could reveal nothing that would compromise others. If she survived, she could disappear completely, returning to ordinary life with no trace of her service. Her anonymity was both her shield and her legacy. Some historians believe Agent 355 played a role in exposing Benedict Arnold's betrayal, possibly through her proximity to British officer John Andre. While definitive proof remains elusive, the timing and content of intelligence flowing from New York suggest that information gathered in social settings was critical to uncovering the plot. If true, this would place Agent 355 at the center of one of the most pivotal moments of the war, influencing events without ever appearing in official records. Speculation about her fate has persisted for centuries. One account suggests she was arrested and imprisoned aboard a British prison ship where conditions were brutal and survival was uncertain. Another possibility is that she escaped detection entirely, vanishing into civilian life once her role was complete. The absence of documentation makes certainty impossible, but this uncertainty is itself revealing. The most successful spies are those who leave the least evidence behind. In recent decades, interest in Agent 355 has grown significantly. Researchers have proposed possible identities, often focusing on women from prominent families who lived in New York during the occupation. These investigations reflect a broader shift in historical understanding, recognizing that intelligence work often relied on individuals who existed outside traditional power structures. Agent 355 represents not only a mystery, but a correction to earlier narratives that overlooked the contributions of women in the Revolution. Her story challenges conventional ideas of heroism. There are no recorded speeches, no battlefield exploits, and no confirmed portrait. Her influence, if accurately understood, came from restraint, discretion, and the ability to remain unnoticed. In a war dominated by noise and spectacle, her silence carried extraordinary weight. She demonstrated that access, patience, and emotional intelligence could rival physical force in shaping events. The legend of Agent 355 also highlights the psychological cost of espionage. To live under constant scrutiny while concealing one's true purpose requires emotional endurance that few could sustain. Every interaction carried risk. Every conversation required calculation. Unlike soldiers, spies had no comradeship in uniform, no public recognition, and no assurance that their sacrifices would ever be acknowledged. Survival depended on isolation. Agent 355's enduring power lies in her invisibility. She embodies the countless individuals whose actions altered history without leaving a name behind. Her story forces us to reconsider how wars are won and who deserves recognition. While generals and armies shape the visible narrative of conflict, figures like Agent 355 operate beneath the surface, quietly influencing outcomes through information rather than force. In the end, the woman known only as 355 represents the highest achievement of the Culper Ring. She fulfilled her mission so completely that history itself could not fully capture her. Her anonymity is not a failure of memory, but evidence of success. She did what she was meant to do, and then she disappeared, leaving behind only a number and a legacy that continues to fascinate and inspire.
Benedict Arnold was not always a traitor, and that truth makes his betrayal more unsettling than any simple story of greed or cowardice. In the early years of the American Revolution, Arnold was considered one of the most capable and aggressive officers in the Continental Army, a man who repeatedly placed himself in danger and achieved victories others could not. He fought with intensity at Quebec, Saratoga, and numerous smaller engagements, earning praise from George Washington himself. Yet beneath the surface of these accomplishments grew a deep resentment that would eventually reshape the war. Arnold believed he was underappreciated, overlooked for promotions, and treated unfairly by Congress. And over time, these grievances hardened into bitterness. Injuries sustained in battle left him in constant pain. Financial trouble strained his pride, and accusations of corruption damaged his reputation, creating a slow-burning sense of betrayal that mirrored the very act he would one day commit. When Arnold was appointed military commander of West Point, a fortress considered the most strategically important position in North America, his access to secrets was unmatched, and his bitterness found an opportunity. West Point controlled the Hudson River, the critical artery connecting New England to the rest of the colonies, and if it fell into British hands, the rebellion could be effectively split in two. Arnold knew this, and he also knew its defenses, troop movements, and vulnerabilities better than anyone. Quietly, he began communicating with the British, offering them the keys to the fortress in exchange for money and a commission in the British Army, a transaction that transformed personal resentment into national danger. The British assigned Major John Andre, a charming and intelligent officer, to handle the negotiations, and the two men began exchanging coded letters through intermediaries, unaware that the very intelligence network Washington had built was closing in around them. Members of the Culper Ring had already been feeding Washington unusually detailed reports about British expectations surrounding West Point, and Talmadge grew suspicious of how confidently the enemy spoke about a future victory there. The turning point came when Andre, traveling in civilian clothes and carrying papers hidden inside his boot, was captured by American militiamen near Tarrytown, New York. These men were not trained intelligence officers, but their caution and refusal of Andre's bribes led to the discovery of the documents, precise plans of West Point's defenses written in Arnold's own hand. When the papers reached Washington's command, the realization was devastating. One of their most trusted generals had been preparing to hand the revolution's lifeline to the enemy. Arnold, warned at the last moment, escaped to British lines, leaving behind a stunned army and a shaken commander-in-chief. Andre, less fortunate, was tried as a spy and hanged, his death stirring sympathy even among his enemies, while Arnold became the most reviled name in American history. For Washington, the betrayal was personal as well as strategic. He had defended Arnold against critics, trusted him with command, and believed in his loyalty. And this betrayal reinforced Washington's understanding of the fragile nature of trust during wartime.
It also validated the necessity of secrecy, compartmentalization, and professional intelligence work, principles that had guided the creation of the Culper Ring. The network had done exactly what it was designed to do: detect danger quietly before it became irreversible. Arnold's betrayal did not end the war, but it altered its emotional landscape, hardening American resolve and reinforcing the belief that independence could only survive through vigilance. In British service, Arnold never found the respect he believed he deserved, and his name became synonymous with treason on both sides of the Atlantic, a reminder that betrayal rarely brings the reward it promises. The Culper Ring, meanwhile, remained silent, its members returning to obscurity, while history remembered the traitor far more clearly than those who stopped him. Yet without their invisible work, the betrayal might have succeeded, and the war could have ended not with independence, but with surrender. In this way, Benedict Arnold's story is inseparable from the story of American intelligence, illustrating not only the danger of divided loyalties, but the power of information to expose them. His fall confirmed what Washington had learned since the fires of New York in 1776, that wars are not only fought on battlefields, but in shadows, where a single secret can determine the fate of a nation.
By 1781, the American Revolution had stretched into its sixth exhausting year, and victory still seemed uncertain. Not because of a lack of courage or sacrifice, but because the war had settled into a brutal stalemate that drained men, money, and morale on both sides. The British still possessed the world's most powerful navy, experienced commanders, and professional troops, while the Continental Army remained underfunded, undersupplied, and heavily dependent on fragile alliances. What finally broke this deadlock was not a sudden surge of military strength, but a convergence of information, timing, and deception that transformed intelligence into decisive action. At the center of this convergence stood George Washington, who had spent years learning how to think not only like a general, but like an intelligence chief, patiently assembling fragments of information into a picture the enemy could not see. British General Charles Cornwallis had positioned his army at Yorktown, Virginia, believing it to be a defensible location supported by the Royal Navy, and British intelligence assured him that Washington's attention remained focused on New York. This belief was not accidental. It was the product of deliberate misinformation, controlled leaks, and carefully staged movements designed to confirm British expectations rather than challenge them. American intelligence networks, including remnants of the Culper Ring's methods, fed this illusion by allowing certain information to reach British ears while concealing the true direction of Allied planning. Washington understood that the British greatest weakness was not their army, but their assumptions, and he exploited this weakness with precision. While appearing to prepare an attack on New York, Washington quietly coordinated with French General Rochambeau and, crucially, with the French Navy under Admiral de Grasse, whose fleet would control the Chesapeake Bay. This coordination depended on accurate intelligence regarding British troop positions, naval movements, and communication delays, all of which had been refined through years of espionage. When de Grasse's fleet arrived and sealed off the bay, Cornwallis found himself trapped, cut off from escape or reinforcement, a strategic nightmare created not by force alone, but by information withheld at exactly the right moment. The siege of Yorktown was swift and methodical, with American and French artillery gradually dismantling British defenses, while British commanders waited in vain for a rescue fleet that would never arrive. Cornwallis's surrender in October 1781 effectively ended major fighting in North America, not because the British Army was destroyed, but because British leadership finally accepted that the cost of continuing the war outweighed any possible gain.
For Washington, Yorktown was the culmination of lessons learned through years of hardship, that secrecy mattered as much as strength, that misinformation could be as powerful as cannons, and that patience could outlast superiority. The intelligence apparatus he had helped build did not win the war on its own, but it shaped the conditions under which victory became possible. Without reliable intelligence, Washington could not have coordinated movements across vast distances, synchronized land and naval forces, or maintained the deception that kept Cornwallis isolated. The legacy of Yorktown is often told through images of marching soldiers and formal surrender ceremonies, but beneath those scenes lay an invisible architecture of information, built slowly and carefully over time. This architecture transformed a fragile rebellion into a credible strategic force capable of defeating a global empire. The victory also reshaped how future conflicts would be fought, embedding intelligence as a permanent component of American military planning. Yorktown demonstrated that wars could be decided not only by who had more soldiers or ships, but by who understood the battlefield better, who controlled the flow of information, and who could act decisively when the moment arrived. As news of the surrender reached Europe, it shifted diplomatic calculations overnight, reinforcing alliances and accelerating negotiations that would lead to formal independence. For the men and women who had operated in secrecy throughout the war, Yorktown was not a moment of celebration, but of quiet confirmation that their efforts had mattered. Their success lay in the fact that history would barely notice them, focusing instead on generals and treaties. Yet without the intelligence that guided every movement toward Yorktown, the opportunity for victory might never have appeared. In this sense, Yorktown was not merely the end of a war, but the validation of a philosophy, that information, carefully gathered and wisely used, could determine the fate of nations.
When the American Revolution ended, the guns fell silent, treaties were signed, and soldiers returned to civilian life. But the lessons learned in secrecy did not disappear with the war. George Washington understood better than most that independence had been secured not only by battlefield courage, but by information carefully gathered, protected, and used at decisive moments. Unlike many leaders of his time, Washington did not dismiss espionage as a temporary wartime necessity. He saw it as an enduring requirement for national survival. In the fragile years following independence, the United States lacked a standing army, a powerful navy, or the financial resources of European empires, but it possessed something equally valuable: experience and intelligence. The methods developed by the Culper Ring, compartmentalization, coded communication, deception, and civilian involvement, became informal doctrines passed quietly through military and political leadership. Washington himself carried these lessons into his presidency, relying on confidential informants and secret correspondence to monitor foreign intentions and domestic threats, setting a precedent for executive intelligence oversight that continues to this day. As the young nation expanded, faced internal rebellion, and navigated the dangers of European rivalry, intelligence remained a shadowy but constant presence, shaping decisions even when it left no visible trace. During the War of 1812, American agents gathered information on British movements, while diplomats relied on clandestine sources to negotiate from positions of strength. In the Civil War, espionage networks grew more formalized, with both Union and Confederate forces employing scouts, informants, and codebreakers, echoing principles first refined during the Revolution. Each conflict added new layers to an evolving tradition, reinforcing the idea that intelligence was not a luxury, but a necessity. By the early 20th century, global conflict forced the United States to confront the limitations of ad hoc intelligence structures. World War I introduced modern signals intelligence, cryptography, and centralized analysis, yet these efforts remained fragmented and temporary, dismantled after the war in a return to isolationism. It was only after the devastating surprise of Pearl Harbor that the United States fully embraced the lesson Washington had learned nearly 2 centuries earlier, that intelligence must be permanent, professional, and insulated from political convenience. The creation of the Office of Strategic Services during World War II marked a turning point, uniting espionage, analysis, and special operations under a single framework. Many of its architects explicitly referenced the revolutionary experience, viewing themselves as heirs to the same tradition of quiet service. When the Central Intelligence Agency was established in 1947, it inherited not only the OSS's structures, but its philosophy, one that traced its lineage directly back to the Culper Ring. The CIA would later acknowledge Washington as its intellectual forefather, recognizing his insistence on secrecy, discipline, and ethical restraint. Training materials referenced his correspondence, his rules for agents, and his emphasis on accuracy over speed, principles still taught to intelligence officers today. What connects the farmers of Setauket to modern intelligence analysts is not technology, but mindset. The understanding that information must be verified, protected, and used with restraint. The tools have changed dramatically, from invisible ink to satellites and cyber networks, but the fundamental challenges remain the same: distinguishing truth from deception, acting under uncertainty, and bearing responsibility for decisions that shape history. The American intelligence tradition grew not from conquest or empire, but from vulnerability, born in a moment when survival depended on knowing more than the enemy. This origin story continues to shape how intelligence is perceived within the United States, often viewed with skepticism, debate, and moral concern, reflecting the tension Washington himself navigated between secrecy and Republican values. Unlike older empires that normalized espionage as an extension of power, American intelligence developed with an awareness of its own dangers, constrained by law, oversight, and public accountability. This tension, while imperfect, remains one of its defining features. The Culper Ring's legacy is not a specific tactic or organization, but a culture of quiet professionalism, one that accepts anonymity as the cost of effectiveness. Its members returned to ordinary lives, their contributions unrecognized for generations, yet their influence persisted in institutions they would never know by name. From the shadows of occupied New York to the corridors of modern intelligence agencies, a continuous thread runs through American history, linking past and present through the disciplined use of information. In understanding this lineage, we see that the United States was not only founded through revolution, but through revelation, through the patient uncovering of truths hidden from view. The nation's first victory was not only military, but intellectual, proving that even in the face of overwhelming power, knowledge, when used wisely, could change the course of history.
History often remembers revolutions as loud events, filled with gunfire, speeches, flags, and dramatic turning points. Yet the American Revolution was also a quiet war, fought in whispers, coded letters, and unremarkable routines that concealed extraordinary risk. Long before victory was assured, before alliances solidified and armies matured, the fate of the rebellion depended on people who understood that survival required more than bravery. It required restraint, patience, and secrecy. George Washington, frequently portrayed as a towering military figure, emerges in this story as something different and perhaps more consequential, a leader who learned how to manage uncertainty, how to accept incomplete information, and how to trust individuals whose greatest success would be remaining invisible. The Culper Ring embodied this philosophy, not through dramatic acts of sabotage or violence, but through careful observation and disciplined silence. Farmers pretended to trade livestock while memorizing troop movements. Shopkeepers counted supplies while listening for rumors, and women signaled naval operations through ordinary household routines that attracted no attention at all. None of them expected statues, pensions, or public gratitude, and most never received it.
Their reward, if it came at all, was the knowledge that their actions might help secure a future they would never fully see. This kind of service does not fit easily into traditional narratives of heroism, yet it shaped the outcome of the war as decisively as any battlefield victory. The success of American intelligence during the Revolution did not lie in brilliance alone, but in discipline, the ability to resist the urge for recognition, to protect secrets even from allies, and to accept personal risk without assurance of acknowledgement. Washington understood that secrecy was not a betrayal of Republican ideals, but a temporary necessity to protect them, and this understanding would influence American governance long after independence was achieved. The intelligence tradition born in those years carried forward a cautious respect for the power of information, coupled with an awareness of its dangers, shaping institutions designed to operate in shadows while remaining accountable to democratic principles. As the United States approached its 250th anniversary, this quieter origin story offers a different way to understand national identity, one that values patience over spectacle and cooperation over individual glory. The revolution was not won by perfect men or flawless strategies, but by ordinary people who adapted, learned, and endured when failure seemed inevitable. Their anonymity was not accidental, it was the foundation of their success. Even today, modern intelligence officers inherit this legacy, working in environments far removed from 18th-century taverns and farmhouses, yet facing the same fundamental challenge: how to gather truth in a world shaped by deception, and how to act responsibly when the consequences are immense. The tools have evolved beyond recognition, but the ethical questions remain strikingly familiar. How much secrecy is necessary to protect a nation? How much transparency is required to preserve its values? These questions do not have simple answers, and Washington himself wrestled with them, aware that power exercised in darkness must always be constrained by purpose and principle. The story of the Culper Ring does not resolve these tensions, it reveals them. It reminds us that the American experiment was born not only from ideals boldly declared, but from compromises carefully managed, risks quietly taken, and truths slowly uncovered. In remembering this, we gain a deeper appreciation for the fragility of independence and the responsibility it demands. America was not only founded through defiance, but through discretion, not only through courage, but through control. The nation that emerged from the Revolution carried within it a hidden inheritance, a recognition that strength does not always announce itself, and that sometimes the most powerful actions leave no visible trace at all. In the end, the American Revolution was won not only on battlefields, but in silence, where ordinary people changed history simply by paying attention, keeping secrets, and trusting that their unseen efforts would matter.